You have understood much about pumping of heart, but now we are going to discuss the graphic analysis of ventricular pumping. The diagram we are going to discuss is especially useful in explaining the pumping mechanics of the left ventricle. The most important components of a diagram are the two curves labeled diastolic pressure and systolic pressure. These curves are volume pressure curves. The diastolic pressure curve is determined by filling the heart with progressively greater volumes of blood, and then measuring the diastolic pressure immediately before ventricular contraction occurs, which is the end diastolic pressure of the ventricle. The systolic pressure curve is determined by recording the systolic pressure achieved during ventricular contraction at each volume of filling, until the volume of a non-contracting ventricle rises above about 150 milliliters. The diastolic pressure does not increase much. Therefore, up to this volume, blood can flow easily into the ventricle from the atrium. Above 150 milliliters, the ventricular diastolic pressure increases rapidly, partly because of fibrous tissue in the heart that will stretch no more, and partly because the pericardium that surrounds the heart becomes filled nearly to its limit. During ventricular contraction, the systolic pressure increases even at low ventricular volumes, and reaches a maximum at a ventricular volume of 150 to 170 milliliters. Then, as the volume increases further, the systolic pressure actually decreases under some conditions, as demonstrated by the following systolic pressure curve. This occurs because at these great volumes, the actin and myosin filaments of the cardiac muscle fibers are pulled apart far enough that the strength of each cardiac fiber contraction becomes less than optimal. This is phase 1, called as period of filling. This is phase 2, called as isovolumetric contraction. This is phase 3, called as period of ejection, while this is phase 4, called as isovolumetric relaxation. The maximum systolic pressure for the normal left ventricle is between 250 and 300 millimeter of mercury, but this varies widely with each person's heart strength and degree of heart stimulation by cardiac nerves. For the normal right ventricle, the maximum systolic pressure is between 60 and 80 millimeter of mercury. This is external work, and this is potential energy. Now let's focus on the volume pressure diagram during a cardiac cycle. These lines form a loop called the volume pressure diagram of a cardiac cycle for normal function of the left ventricle. Let's study a more detailed version of this loop. It is divided into 4 phases. Phase 1 is the period of filling. Phase 1 in the volume pressure diagram begins at a ventricular volume of about 50 millimeter and a diastolic pressure of 2 to 3 millimeter of mercury. The amount of blood that remains in the ventricle after the previous heartbeat, 50 milliliters, is called the end systolic volume. As venous blood flows into the ventricle from the left atrium, the ventricular volume normally increases to about 120 milliliter, called the end diastolic volume, an increase of 70 milliliter. Therefore, the volume pressure diagram during phase 1 extends from point A to point B, with the volume increasing to 120 milliliter, and the diastolic pressure rising to about 5 to 7 millimeter of mercury. Phase 2 is the period of isovolumetric contraction. During isovolumetric contraction, the volume of the ventricle does not change because all valves are closed. However, the pressure inside the ventricle increases to equal the pressure in the aorta at a pressure value of about 80 millimeter of mercury, as depicted by point C. Phase 3 is the period of ejection. During ejection, the systolic pressure rises even higher because of still more contraction of the ventricle. At the same time, the volume of the ventricle decreases because the aortic valve has now opened and blood flows out of the ventricle into the aorta. Phase 4 is the period of isovolumetric relaxation. At the end of the period of ejection, which is point D, the aortic valve closes, and the ventricular pressure falls back to the diastolic pressure level. The line labeled 4 traces this decrease in intraventricular pressure without any change in volume. Thus, the ventricle returns to its starting point, with about 50 milliliter of blood left in the ventricle at an atrial pressure of 2 to 3 millimeter of mercury. EW represents the net external work output of the ventricle during its contraction cycle. In experimental studies of cardiac contraction, this diagram is used for calculating cardiac work output. When the heart pumps large quantities of blood, the area of the work diagram becomes much larger. That is, it extends far to the right. Because the ventricle fills with more blood during diastole, it rises much higher because the ventricle contracts with greater pressure. And it usually extends farther to the left because the ventricle contracts to a smaller volume, especially if the ventricle is stimulated to increased activity by the sympathetic nervous system. Now moving towards the concepts of preload and afterload. In assessing the contractile properties of muscle, it is important to specify the degree of tension on the muscle when it begins to contract, called the preload, and to specify the load against which the muscle exerts its contractile force, called the afterload. For cardiac contraction, the preload is usually considered to be the end diastolic pressure when the ventricle has become filled. The afterload of the ventricle is the pressure in the aorta leading from the ventricle. This corresponds to the systolic pressure described by the phase 3 curve of the volume pressure diagram. Sometimes the afterload is loosely considered to be the resistance in the circulation rather than a pressure. The importance of the concepts of preload and afterload is that in many abnormal functional states of the heart or circulation, the pressure during filling of the ventricle, called as the preload, the arterial pressure against which the ventricle must contract, called as the afterload. This was all about this section. In our next section, we will talk about the regulation of heart pumping.
Explore our extensive library of over 1,800 video lectures to learn about a wide range of topics. Only on sqadia.com.